Will the real Thabo Bester please stand up? Well, it's me, says one elderly man from Heidelberg, and I never committed robbery. I only committed murder. It's a convoluted tale that has the makings of a Netflix docudrama hit, no doubt. So on the 3rd of May last year, if you haven't heard of this story, the Department of Correctional Services announced that Thabo Bester, also known as the infamous Facebook rapist, had set himself alight in his cell and died. The coroner's report also suggested that he had suffered a blunt force trauma injury before he died. Except, had he really? The investigative unit Ground Up revealed recently that a man with a striking likeness to Bester was photographed shopping at Sandton City 2 months after his supposed death. He was allegedly in the company of the celebrity doctor Nandipha Magudumana. It's also understood that she tried to secure the body of whoever died in the fire, claiming rights to it as Bester's supposed customary wife. How on earth could something like this happen? Well, to help us wade through the possibilities, we are joined by Chad Thomas, who's a financial and organized crime investigator from IRS Forensic Investigations. Chad, a very good morning to you, and thank you for your time today.
Thank you, and good morning to all.
Look, I'm going to mention some specifics about the case. I don't necessarily expect you to comment on the details, but rather more generally about how this kind of thing could happen. But let's start with this. The Department of Correctional Services surely has quite a bit of egg on their face over this.
An immense amount. I think this is incompetence or negligence or corruption of the highest degree.
There are a number of salacious details in this story, including the fact that Bester was allegedly running a multi-million rand business from within prison walls. I mean, the glitterati and the well-heeled even attended a launch of a supposed foundation of his, at which we understand he spoke virtually, and there he was wearing designer gear, a luxury watch, claiming to be overseas, when in fact he was behind bars. So all of this begins even before the escape.
It does, and it just shows the complicity on the part of the officials within what is meant to be a maximum security prison. How do you get those clothing in? How are you able to have these broadcasts where you're purportedly in another place? If you're in maximum security, you're under constant control. They're managing your movement. They're monitoring you. So this could never, ever have been pulled off without the complicity of others within the system.
And even if we talk about, the death of whoever it is that died in the fire, if the department is telling us that that person was also the victim of a blunt force injury, they surely then couldn't have set themselves alight, because there's every indication this person may have even died before the fire.
No, this has all the indications of a very well thought out escape plan. Either somebody was murdered outside of the prison and brought in so that the body could be used, or another inmate or somebody who worked in the prison was murdered so that they could use that body. The fact that the body was burnt, of course, was to hide the true identity of the individual. They're relying on the fact that South Africa has a historic backlog of DNA testing that's taking place. And who would have really cared? This is a person that had been in prison for some of the most heinous crimes. He stalked women on Facebook. He murdered women. He was involved in some seriously violent crimes dating back to 2010, 2011. So who would have really thought that the authorities would go to the extent that they should have actually gone to proven who this person was that was dead in the cell? And of course, they relied on the fact that he was purportedly, in inverted commas, in solitary confinement. And as such, it could have only been him, because there's such massive restricted movement within that prison complex.
While Bester's story will no doubt get tongues wagging, the other concern I have is, what about others? And his crimes were awful enough, certainly to the victims and their families, but there are people with more consequential crimes, if you will, in terms of their impact on society at large. I'm talking now about mafia bosses, leaders of criminal syndicates. If somebody like Thabo Bester could achieve this, one shudders to think what those who are truly connected are able to do.
money can buy you anything in prison, as is indicative by this particular case. But one must remember the prison gangs in South Africa have run the prisons for a very long time. In fact, some of South Africa's gangs within the prison structures have been in existence for longer than most gangs worldwide. We have a long, torturous history of gangs within the prison system, whether it's the Numbers gangs, whether it's the Royal Air Force, or whether it's the Springbokke who are trying to escape, whether it's the 2-6, the 2-7s, the 2-8. They have this long history, and part of their process is, of course, to either use threats of bodily harm or financial incentive to those who are meant to be securing them in that facility to bring them favors. And those favors can be anything. One looks at some of the syndicates that have been exposed recently in prisons. There was a syndicate in Leeuwkop prison. There was a syndicate in Nkosi Mampuru prison that were actually operating sextortion rings from within the walls of the prison, claiming to be police officers and sending out messages and getting money paid into e-wallet accounts. So it's just a bizarre situation, and once again, it shows the collapse of yet another vital institution within our country's government, and that is the safekeeping of these prisoners. It's not to keep them safe, it's to keep us safe from them by having them locked up.
Well, the other element which bears mentioning is that, in fact, this is a facility that is run by a private company, G4S. How much does that complicate things?
I'm not sure how it's going to complicate things. If we look at the American prison system, it's based largely on privatized prisons, the same in Europe. So I don't think one can lay the blame at the security company who's been employed to run this particular prison. We've seen instances, like I mentioned, at Leeuwkop, which is run by DCS. We've seen instances at Nkosi Mampuru, which is run by DCS. But when one looks at a prisoner profile such as Thabo Bester, if that's what we can call him, because he has so many aliases, one would think that he could have been locked up perhaps at CMAX in Kokstad or CMAX at Nkosi Mampuru. Why was he sitting in this particular prison, and how was it that there were no checks and balances? Because it seems as if he had the run of his section.
Yeah, but what about accountability even for this private company? So far, we haven't had a whiff of accountability, no sense that action, I don't know, perhaps the suspension of their contract, that kind of thing might happen as a consequence of this.
We obviously aren't privy to the contract that's been signed between G4S and the DCS, but what I would imagine is that there would be a lot of claims. You must remember, we're dealing with somebody who displays massive sociopathic traits, who's used various guises and names. He's a chameleon of sorts, and he's not going to stop now that he's on the run. So you can see that there will be claims against the state. Whether those claims are also against the private company that was engaged to secure this facility, we'll have to see, but it comes down to the engagement between them and DCS. But there are definitely going to be claims made, and there has to be some form of accountability and consequence in respect of this. And what I'm hoping is not just another commission of inquiry. What we need here is a high-level investigation, but a proper investigation, not an investigation that waxes lyrical, something that actually comes out with what transpired and puts a stop to any future potential such instances.
It's quite extraordinary. And then the department, of course, tried to shush the media with a convicted rapist on the loose. It is really quite unbelievable. Chad Thomas, appreciate your time. Chad is a financial and organized crime investigator from IRS Forensic Investigations. And again, I put it to you, yes, of course, the famous or the infamous Facebook rapist, his crimes were devastating to his victims. I get that, and I don't mean to minimize it at all. But just think about what gang leaders, these are people who can send other people to commit more crimes, are able to do if he could achieve this.
Current events, developing stories,
tough questions,
your voice making a difference.
This is Breakfast with Bongani Bingwa.